Hey y'all, so I'm going to review some key events and topics that you definitely want to study before your exam tomorrow. So, one of the biggest court decisions in U.S. history is this Plessy versus Ferguson case. This case that determined that separate but equal was legal. It represented many white Americans' resistance to give full equality to black people even after Reconstruction. And it also reinforced the one drop rule. Homer Plessy, the man that sued, he was only 1/8 black, so he also did not understand why, with him having such a small percentage of black in him, he was having to sit in a blacks only section. So one, this court case decided that separate but equal was legal, and it also reinforced the idea that no matter what small of a percentage of black you have in you, you are still black. Westward expansion was also something that presented itself again in this unit. One thing you really want to understand about westward expansion in the Gilded Age is that the government really incentivized moving westward with the Homestead Act, the Morrill Act, and the Pacific Railway Act, really encouraging Americans to start moving west. With a lot of these Americans moving westward, though, it started to increase tensions between white Americans and Native Americans. With a lot of white Americans now moving into native land, they're starting to compete with natives over resources that were once owned solely by natives. Westward expansion also led to the destruction and the mass killing of the buffalo population, which cut off the natives' main food source and way of life. A ton of treaties with natives were being broken, so the US would create treaties with natives, but then break them, justifying it by saying that because natives did not have one whole cohesive government, that their treaties were inadequate. Even though, of course, natives have different tribes, so you can't expect the Pueblo people to have ties in government with the Iroquois in the Northern Territory. So honestly, that just makes no sense to me. And then lastly, there was a push to assimilate natives into American culture, thinking that this would dissolve native culture, right? Because they can't commit one whole mass genocide on natives with them expanding westward. But what they could do was dissolve native culture at the very least by forcing natives to assimilate into a white American society, which in my opinion is still genocide itself. European immigration in the 19th century definitely looked different based on which region these Europeans were coming from. So in the earlier 19th century, most immigrants were coming from Northern and Western Europe. So think France, think even Great Britain, think Germany, right? They usually moved to the frontier and pursued mining, farming, and ranching, so they were able to build somewhat successful lives for themselves. Later on in the 19th century, you see immigrants start coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and they typically moved to more industrialized cities in the north, like Chicago, like Philadelphia, like New York, and also worked in factories. So a ton of these immigrants that were coming from Southern and Eastern Europeans were becoming laborers in the United States. During the Gilded Age, industrialization definitely increased because this is the second industrial revolution. So new technological innovations dramatically changed American society. That Bessemer process, the Transcontinental Railroad, the Haytedder, definitely impacted how society was able to function. So labor unions also became a thing during this time period. As industries are growing, there are more laborers now, and there are more people advocating for some of the unsafe working conditions, low pay, and long hours that were forced upon laborers. Also, remember that many immigrants were a part of these movements because a ton of them were a part of that working class. A ton were working in these industries and were being harmed and were being taken advantage of, with a lot of them not speaking English or being fully assimilated into American culture yet. All right, y'all. And then also, when we're talking about laborers and immigrants being manipulated, we also want to think about political machines. So they gain power through that manipulation of the poor and new immigrants. And they indirectly kept cities from being able to grow economically because all of those taxes that the new immigrants and the poor are paying to their city governments are going into the pockets of political machines and not to the city itself. So with political machines being in these communities, though they promise to improve communities, it didn't necessarily look like they were doing that because they were really keeping money away from the city itself. And then also remember, robber barons are just corrupt businessmen. They use laissez-faire economics to their advantage, and they also form trust and holding companies to manipulate the cost of goods. So remember, a trust is when like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Sierra Mist, 7-Up, all these different soda brands all form one board of directors that states that, okay, one can of soda is now going to cost $20 for folks. And none of them are charging less than that. So people are being forced to pay $20 for one can of soda, regardless of which company they're going to. So they definitely did this a lot during the Gilded Age. And you'll notice in political cartoons with robber barons, they're typically like taking advantage of the poor, right? We can see their laborers down here holding them up, only being paid $6 a week or $7 a week. And then the CEOs of these companies like Vanderbilt, Gold, Carnegie, Rockefeller, they're all just kind of eating up all of that cash and not giving it to their laborers. When we talk about farmers and laborers being taken advantage of, whoo, y'all, I'm getting tongue-tied. We also want to talk about the Populist Party. I'm gonna have to take a break in a minute. All right, so they were against laissez-faire policies. So they were against what these big businessmen, these robber barons, loved. They supported government intervention in big businesses, and they were created by the Farmers Alliance and the Knights of Labor. So literally created by laborers and farmers, both groups of people who were against robber barons. And lastly, y'all, with the Gilded Age, we really want to understand like why it's called gilded and not golden. Usually when we talk about a society booming, a time period where a country is booming, it's called the Golden Age. Like England had a golden age, France had a golden age, all of these different countries had a golden age. But this can't necessarily be called our golden age because though it is so beautiful and shiny and it looks rich on the outside, we know that new immigrants were not being treated properly, natives were being taken advantage of, Black people were not being given equal rights, and so many other different like things that were happening that weren't necessarily progressing in society. So that's basically the main takeaway from the Gilded Age, and like one of the key concepts we should really understand as we move into Unit 7. I hope this review video helped y'all. If you're still confused about any of these topics that I talked about, definitely send me a Teams message. I got y'all. I'll explain it a little more, or I could recommend some videos to watch. But yeah, I know we're going to do great on our exams tomorrow. Complete that reading guide and study, study, study. But don't study too much to where you're crying like that meme I posted last week.